have some, interesting international events going on these days, I wanted to touch base on that subject a little bit and look at it from the biblical perspective. So I want you guys to open 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verses 24 through 27. And while you're opening these verses, this passage from the Bible, I'd like to ask you if you heard about sportsmen or sportswomen who lose weight to qualify for a competition or to win something. For example, in boxing, there are different divisions where people compete, right? And you can't weigh 200 pounds and compete with someone who is 150 pounds only. You can't. Those are different weight categories, different divisions. And what some sportsmen do in order to qualify for a specific division, they lose weight. They practice a lot first to grow their muscles, and then they would lose weight, and they use different strategies. And sometimes you hear crazy stories about a sportsman who lost 50 pounds or who lost 20 pounds in a week or in 2 weeks just to qualify for that competition. And that requires a lot of efforts, that requires a lot of self-control. And one remarkable example is Ken Jones. Maybe you have never heard about this guy, but this is just a regular guy who actually a retiree from Texas, who achieved his lifelong dream of winning a bodybuilding competition. After a 26-year break from the gym, he lost over 150 pounds of weight to compete. Jones not only won first place in his division in 2021, but also earned his marks against men who were 20 years younger than him. Imagine this. I'm not going to show you the picture of him just to not to provoke you, right? But the guy looks incredibly fit and sporty, and his dedication to fitness, including walking, consistent gym sessions, and meticulous tracking of nutrients, allowed him to transform his health and achieve his goals. That was his lifelong dream, and finally, when he retired, he achieved that goal. We're going to talk today about self-control. And I'm really concerned that by the end of the sermon, half of you would leave, because that's not a popular subject to talk about self-control. If I was talking about pleasures, about some, great things, about love, about, happiness, gladness, everyone is happy and interested to learn something new about those things or emotions or feelings, so to speak. But when we speak about things not so exciting, I'm afraid that things can get a little bit different. As Vasiliy has mentioned, that these days the Olympics have started in France, and unfortunately there are a lot of demonic or even satanic symbols and elements for example, in the opening ceremony, if you saw it or if you saw pictures from it, a lot of pagan elements were included there. However, if you take that part aside and just look at the physical part of it, at the competition part of the games, you can find some references to that in the Bible, and that's what we're going to talk about today. And we can read this in the passage that we opened, and let's read it together. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. That's a very interesting passage, because Apostle Paul talks to the church in Corinth, and in Greece, or in the ancient world of that time, there were two famous games or two competitions that were very known to everyone. It was the Olympic Games and it was the Isthmian Games. Isthmian Games were actually they took place in Corinth, exactly where this church was located. And when Apostle Paul refers to this example from sports life, it was understood for those people who listened to this message or who read the letter that Apostle Paul sent to them. It's interesting that at the time, there was no big prizes for winning in the competition, in different competitions. It was at a pretty primitive level at the time. There were no, funds, no sponsors for games, no big banks to support those games. The main prize that the winner would get was a wreath. Basically, usually it was made from a fir tree or a different kind of tree. I believe Romans changed it to a different tree, but originally in Greece it was made of a fir tree. So it was a wreath that they would put on the head of the winner. That's the only prize. And people would go above and beyond to achieve that prize. To get that prize, they would practice a lot of self-control. They would train a lot. They would prepare for those games just to do that. And Apostle Paul says that those people do go to this extent just to get this perishable or perishing. Let's read how it says it. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. This is what he says. He says that they do it just to get it here, and it will probably be thrown away after some time because it withers away, and it kind of loses its quality, loses its beauty, if you wish, and you can't do anything with it anymore. But he says that we have a much higher price, much more valuable price, because it's imperishable. You can't lose it or it can't perish. And this is and that's why he says, So I do not run aimlessly, and I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. So he's really concerned, and imagine here, he's not talking about spiritual life, he's not talking about how to practice spiritual gifts and things like that. He's talking about his body. He says that I discipline my body and I keep it under control. And that's why we're talking. In this small passage, he's actually talking or mentioning self-control twice, just in 4 verses. He's talking twice about that. And that's why we will talk about this as well. He basically says, if we look at self-control from various other perspectives, we can see that self-control is one of the things that confirms our calling to be children of God. Apostle Paul actually says, for this very reason, make every effort to supplement your faith with virtue, and virtue with knowledge, and knowledge with self-control, and self-control with affection, and brotherly affection with love. So he's mentioning a few things which are really important for us, which designate us as the children of God. So when we look at these items, or when we look at these things, we can see that we need self-control to reach our goal. Our flesh is constantly in the state of war with our spirit. They are fighting each other because our flesh is born sinful and our spirit is born again from God. When we came to God, when we repented, when we turned around and we followed God, our spirit has received a new nature, a new beginning, and this creates a conflict in our identity. We no longer are in the state of peace or in the state of comfort. We are now in the state of war with our own flesh. And that's going to continue until our death, until the time we pass on to eternity. into the eternity. And the Bible shows us at least 4 areas where we should practice self-control. We actually, because we don't have too much time, we will focus just on the 3 of them. So let's talk about 3 most important things that Bible teaches us about self-control, or areas where we can practice it. And the first one is self-control in food and alcohol. It's interesting what Bible says about this, and maybe to me it's even mysterious why the Bible pays so much attention to food. Have you noticed that Bible talks a lot about food? And maybe it is because we cannot survive without eating. We should eat. And if you don't eat, you will die. But if you eat too much, you will also die. So there should be a balance in our consumption of food, and it is part of our self-control. It's not exclusively just for Christians. I believe any reasonable person, any person with common sense understands that. But for Christians, there is also a spiritual context in that. There is also a spiritual background, because self-control helps us achieve our spiritual goals by practicing self-control in our body. So, for example, it was interesting that even Solomon advised in his teachings, when we read Proverbs 23, chapter 23, he says, when you sit down to eat with a ruler, observe carefully what is before you, and put a knife to your throat if you are given to appetite. Do not desire his delicacies, for they are deceptive food. It's an interesting passage. He actually says, practice self-control if you sit with someone famous, with the ruler, with the king, that kind of people, because they may actually test you by doing that. And you need to make sure that you can, if you are given to appetite, make sure you can control your appetite, because you don't know what he's doing that. Also, maybe, I don't know, maybe at that time there was also a risk of being poisoned, because, we're talking about East, and Eastern culture is kind of different in that regard. So maybe in the ancient times, that was something that the food was used for, to poison people used food to poison their enemies, which is, no surprise. But generally, I think the main reason for saying that was that you don't want to show as you're too hungry in front of a ruler. You don't want to show that you can't control your passions or your desires. You need to practice that. And that's probably important for us as well when we're talking about our body and our spirit. If you guys know that in the past there was such kind of a sport when people would do dog fights. I believe it's no longer happening here in the States, but in some countries it is still the case. It's still happening. When people would breed dogs and they would train them to fight each other, and people would bring them to competitions and they would make money on those fights. The people would bet money, owners would get those money. So that was a pretty good business. And if you imagine you lived at the time and you were taking part in that competition, imagine you have 2 fight dogs, and you are feeding one dog and you are not feeding or depriving of food the other dog. If they start fighting, which dog do you think will win the fight? Of course, the one that you're feeding, because that dog gets, nutrients, gets strength, grows muscles, and things like that. And that's why you will be able to win. The same happens with our flesh and our spirit. If we continue to feed just our flesh and we are depriving our spirit of the spiritual food, our flesh will win. the desires of the flesh will win over the desires of the spirit. And that's the problem that we are running all the time. And interesting that Jesus was, when he was talking to his disciples, he said, "But watch yourself, lest your hearts be weighted down with dissipation and drunkenness and cares of this life, and the day come upon you suddenly like a trap." Very interesting, because at that time, even at the dawn of Christianity, dissipation was something that people would, spend time in. They would kind of use their resources, their food abundantly. I mean, those rich people who were at the time. And Jesus warned his disciples against that. It was a problem to the point where the food was the problem, to the point that when the first apostles assembled, because Gentiles started coming to Christ, they repented, and churches started forming from them. Those Jews who were, taught in the law of Moses, they started telling them to follow the law of Moses. And that created a lot of confusion among those first Christians. They didn't know actually what to do, what not to do. So this issue was brought up to the apostles in Jerusalem, and they met, they came together, and they discussed this issue, and they made a decision, and they kind of made the sort of an instruction to those Christians, and they said that they decided that Christians should abstain from the things polluted by idols, and that included food, or food in the first place, and from sexual immorality, and from what has been strangled, and from blood. There are 4 things that apostles wrote to those first Christians, to those who repented from the Gentiles, and they told them to abstain from those, meaning practice self-control. Abstain from those things. Don't use them. Don't use that food that was sacrificed to idols. Don't participate in sexual immorality. Don't consume blood. Meaning don't eat blood. It has nothing to do with the medical procedures, by the way. And don't use or don't eat something that was strangled, like those animals that were strangled, because apparently they contain blood in their meat. So therefore, it was very important at the time. Also, we talk that we can see that the Bible does not condemn food, but it does encourage moderation or abstinence, or even self-control. We can tell it as self-control or abstinence from gluttony. We read in Romans, "Let us walk properly in the daytime, not in orgies and drunkenness, not in sexual immorality and sensuality, not in quarreling and jealousy, but put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires." If you look at this verse that we just read, or verses that we just read, from the perspective of this example with the fight dogs, you can see that he also talks about 2 opposite things. Here, Apostle Paul says that if you indulge, or if you spend time, or if you participate in orgies, drunkenness, sexual immorality, sensuality, quarreling and jealousy, that's the flesh life, or mortal life. And if you do the opposite, if you put on Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires, you are on the opposite side of it. You are doing those things which will benefit your spirit. When we look at those things like alcohol, it takes even more dangerous place. There are more warnings in the Bible related to alcohol than the food. It's also interesting, even though the Bible doesn't say, do not use alcohol at all, right? And unfortunately, because of that, there are some people who start abusing it, or use it to the point that they say, well, the Bible doesn't prohibit it. That means that I can use it, and that creates a problem as well. Interesting enough, Solomon said, do not even look at wine. do not even look at wine because as it sparkles in the cup, because in the end it bites like a serpent and stings like an adder. That's an interesting phrase, and I believe Solomon, more than anyone else, had lots of opportunities to test those things and test how alcohol affects the body of a person or a human body, right? So it's important that we don't fall into those temptations and we don't become subject to those fleshly or to those desires of our body. There are also things where Christians in the past or in the old times, maybe in the current times as well, where Christians would forbid to use food or to use specific kinds of food. And when we read that in the first Timothy chapter 4, Apostle Paul even said that there are people who forbid people to use food, and that's not what God called us to. This is not what you should be preaching. Basically, what he said is that there is a balance in that. So like not using the food is bad, using too much food is bad as well. And he says forbidding that there are people forbidden to marry and commanding to abstain from foods which God created to be used with thanksgiving by those who believe and know the truth. Interesting enough, he said that you should use food with thanksgiving. Bless the Lord for the food that you have. Be thankful for what God has given you. But of course, there is a balance in that. Another area of self-control is an interesting area, which is sex. And this is what God says in Bible also a lot. This is a big category and where God calls us to practice self-control. God created sexual relationship to exist inside of a marriage, right? And when people started using it outside of marriage, that became a punishable sin. Actually, it's a sin which God even punished by death if we read the law of Moses. And by the way, a lot of Muslim countries right now which actually created their teaching based on the law of Moses and based on Torah and based on the scripture, they just changed that to a certain extent. They still practice death punishment for those sexual sins. And it's important that God called his children, called us to avoid sexual immorality. Such sins as adultery or fornication, which is actually sex outside of marriage, this is a sin that was clearly said. And he said that God says that the marriage relationship should be pure and faithful. Actually, in Hebrews we read, "Let marriage be held in honor among all, and let the marriage bed be undefiled, for God will judge the sexually immoral and adulterous." It's interesting that God created us with those desires, with passions. However, he told us how to use our passions. He said that I also create marriage, and you should do it inside of the marriage. If you do it outside of the marriage, that's not the intent. That's not God's plan for people. And this is where a lot of issues, a lot of problems, a lot of broken families happen because people use it outside of marriage. And if you remember the verse that we read earlier about the assembly of apostles and what they instructed the Gentiles during that meeting or during that gathering, they said to abstain from that, food given to idols and also from sexual immorality, because they knew that it was a problem. So it was one of the most important parts that apostles needed to teach people and Christians at the time. There is an interesting part by Apostle Peter. He says in 1 Peter 2:11, "Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul." So he's saying about these things, and he says that it is important for us to abstain from those desires of the flesh. Interesting also in 1 Thessalonians we read, "For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you abstain from sexual immorality." Again and again and again we read multiple verses in the Bible which warn us about how bad and how important it is to avoid those sexual related sins. And we could talk about that, but at the same time, remember that self-control is not about eliminating something completely out of your life, like we talked about the food, right? It's not about getting rid of the fridge in your house. You need to have the balance in that, and this is what self-control is about. Interesting enough that some people started using that, even at that time, started using that to control their spouse or to punish their spouse. And we read in 1 Corinthians 7:5 where he says, "Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourself to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So he's talking to married Christians, and he's talking to them, and he says, "Do not deprive one another." And NAS is, excuse me, a New American Standard Bible translation, let me say it like that, actually translated this phrase by "stop depriving one another," which implies that there was a practice of depriving of one another of the sexual relationship. And Apostle Paul talks to those Christians, and he says, "Stop depriving." Actually, NASB translation considered is a little bit more accurate than ESV that we read generally. So it says, "Stop depriving." And it's, because some people actually used it to, maybe because they had good intentions, kind of like to live a more spiritual life, to be closer to God when you abstain of those things. At the same time, Apostle Paul says, this is not what God created sex for. This is not what God created marriage for. He said that you should abstain from those things only for the time of prayer. And in other translations, for example, in Russian translation, it says for the time of fasting and prayer, and then come together and be together again. And like I said, people like extremes. There are people who practice sexual immorality, and there are people who practice full abstinence, who say that Christians should use this sort of relationship only for reproduction, and that's it. But this is not what God tells us. This is not what God teaches us, because we read in the Bible that self-control is about doing that in the right way, how God designed it to be, how God designed us to use those gifts that He's given to us. God is not against pleasures when those pleasures are not sinful. God is not against, because He actually created those pleasures. He created our passions inside, but He gave us the way how to use those passions. And I even know some churches, they teach that, for example, you should abstain from those relationships with your spouse 3 days before communion. And when I first heard about that, maybe you heard about the teaching as well. When I heard about that, I was pretty surprised, and I talked to one of the leaders of the church, and he said that actually it's based on the story of David. If you remember, when David came once to the priest, when he was running away from Saul with his men, he came to the priest, and there was no food for them to eat except for the holy bread that was in at the tent, the holy tent at the time. And the priest asked David, "Did you abstain from women?" And David answered, we haven't been with women for 3 days, meaning that they were on the road for 3 days and they didn't have their wives with them. After that, the priest gave them the holy bread to eat. So some people take this as the basis for avoiding the marital relationship 3 days before communion. But if we start thinking about this, and if we look in the Bible, we don't see any confirmation for that. We don't see that because even the first church practiced communion every day. Every day. They were gathering, they were praising Lord, they were thankful for the food they had, and they also did communion in recognition or in remembrance of the sacrifice that Jesus did on the cross. And they did it every day. So it would be impossible for them to use that practice that we just talked about at the time. So it's important for us to understand that God tells us that self-control is important in sexual relationship, but it is also about the balance. And lastly, the third area that we are going to talk today about of self-control is self-control in acts and thoughts. Self-control in acts and thoughts. And actually, this is the most difficult part to do. This is the most difficult part to do because we all have emotions. We all have different feelings. And sometimes our emotions take over our common sense or our reasoning, our cold reasoning, so to speak. And sometimes we do crazy things just because we are under a certain emotion. For example, we became upset. And instead of taking time and thinking about that situation and approaching it from a reasonable perspective, we go ahead and we confront someone who created that condition of being upset for us, and we confront them and we ruin the relationship and we create a conflict, and we do this just because we had the lack of self-control. We couldn't control our emotion. Or, for example, when we are in a different situation, when we are tempted to, I don't know, you see something that doesn't belong to you, that is just laying around, that's not yours, and you see that it's a valuable thing, and we are tempted to just grab it because, well, no one has it, or the person who has it, they don't know that I can grab it, and that is stealing. That becomes, so lack of self-control, controlling your desires, becomes a sin. And this is why Bible has so many places which tells us to practice self-control and thoughts. For example, Romans 13:14 says, "Put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh, lest you gratify its lusts." It actually says that put on the Lord Jesus Christ so that we do not gratify the desires of our flesh. This is the way how to practice self-control in our thoughts, in our acts. It is very difficult to do in our age because we live in the culture which does not praise self-control, which actually praises the absence of limits and or instant gratification. If you look at the so-called Amazon culture, this is one of the best examples of instant gratification. This is when you want to do something, you just pull out your cell phone and you order that through the app, and then the thing, well, it used to arrive in 2 days if you had Prime subscription, right? Now it arrives the next day in most cases. And basically you want something, you don't have to wait for a month to do that or go to the store to buy it. You can just click a button and it will be at your porch the next day. That's what is instant gratification. This is when people gratify their desires instantly. Also, I've noticed that, working in a business, I've noticed the cultural difference between different generations of people. If you look at older people, you see people have a lot of more patience and self-control, if you wish, in, for example, building their career, because they have enough patience to wait, to give the time to their job or to their employer to show themselves, to prove themselves, to prove their worth, so to say, right? And when you look at the younger generation, usually it's like they just come to work, it is a few months, and it's pretty often when after a few months, young people just jump jobs because they don't have that patience to give time to their job, to prove themselves. And I once had a conversation with a young person who came to work for the company, and then after just a few months, I believe it was just 8 or 9 months, the person was putting in their resignation. And I'm like, what's happening? What's the reason for your resignation? And the person says, this young person says, well, I'm not making an impact here. I'm not making an impact. I'm like, well, you've been here just for 9 months. What kind of impact you're talking about? If you were here for 10 years and you would come to me and say, I'm not making an impact, I would understand. But we even don't know you yet. You've been here just for 9 months. And people just want this instant results, instant gratification. And that's what the modern culture we're living in right now. As the opposite to that, I can give a great example of the construction of St. Vitus Cathedral in Prague. This is the Czech Republic in Europe, right? I'm sure most of you have seen that gorgeous picture of this cathedral, and it is crazy to think that it was been built for 585 years. The construction started, if I'm not mistaken, in the 14th century, and it was completed in 1929. When I think about this construction process, the first architect, the first designers, the first builders, they knew that they will die and they will not see this cathedral in its beauty. They knew this because they were laying out the foundation for a great building, for a great construction, and they knew that they wouldn't see it. Imagine this. Because we all want something to be done immediately. We want to achieve immediate results. We want to go to job and get a promotion right away. Or we want to, for example, if you start your life, you want to live in a beautiful house right away instead of going to a cheap apartment and to start building your wealth or building up your foundation, a financial foundation, so to speak. Those people spent, and I believe there were 3 or 4 architects who worked on that building over this time, and they were developing this building and making it even more beautiful over all this time. And this is what patience is. This is what self-control is. When people understand that they are working for the future, they are putting away this gratification because they knew that someone else after them will use these results. As Pastor Vasiliy said, that we are standing on the shoulders of those people that when we get results, when we do something substantial, it's usually because we're standing on the shoulders of the giants, on the foundation that someone else laid out for us. And for that reason, it is important for us to use it. To use self-control and patience and practice patience. The Bible also calls us for self-control in other areas of life, such as anger and greed. For example, 1 Thessalonians says, "Abstain from every form of evil." And also we can read in Proverbs, "Like a city broken down and without walls is a man who has no rule over his own spirit." And on the contrary, the scripture says, "He who is slow to anger is better than the mighty, and he who rules his spirit is better than the one who takes a city." Very interesting. So the Bible over and over again tells us to use self-control in our emotions and in our feelings, because this is something that will benefit our relationship with each other. This is something that will benefit our relationship with God. Giving someone the benefit of the doubt is important instead of judging someone. This is also a form of self-control. So this is important for us. And when we if we come back to the original verse or passage that we read from 1 Corinthians, we can see that Apostle Paul applies those principles to himself. And he says, I control my body because I don't want to be disqualified at the end of the race. We all run for the prize. I don't believe that someone is coming here just, for fun. Maybe. But I hope that we don't have people who come to church just for fun, because that would be probably something that Apostle Paul calls beating the air. Like you are not achieving any result, you are not achieving any goal. So it's important for us to do it the way how God, to live our life the way how God told us to live, because this is what He did for us on the cross as well. Jesus Christ was the one who had a lot of patience and who practiced a lot of self-control. He could destroy the world just by one word. He could get off the cross. He could get away from Pilate, from Herod, and from all the sufferings, even if he said just one word. There was a legion of angels who was ready to come to his rescue. And we know that Jesus Christ didn't do that because He came to the earth for a mission. He had the mission to save us. And He was the one who practiced self-control probably more than any of us can do. Let's stand up and pray.